Percival was an unassuming, mid-sized tabby cat who possessed glossy orange fur, a plump belly, and a remarkable pair of green eyes that seemed to sparkle with curiosity. He lived in a quaint townhouse with an elderly retired music teacher, Miss Euphemia Clothilda Abernathy. Hidden away in a sleepy city suburb, they coexisted quietly. Percival basked in the sunbeams that sliced through the curtains each morning, and Miss Abernathy occasionally practiced her viola under the same rays of warm light. Peculiar though it was, Percival was not an ordinary cat. He had a skill that separated him from the standard alley cat or house tabby. He could talk like a perfectly articulate gentleman. Yet, beyond that gift of gab, he had a dream so luminous it eclipsed the patch of sun he liked to lounge in. Percival yearned to be an opera singer. He wasn't entirely sure where this notion came from. Perhaps it was the scratchy old vinyl records Miss Abernathy would spin during calm afternoons, ariats, duets, grand finales. Or maybe it was the black and white photos of entitled sopranos and chiseled tenors tacked to the walls of Miss Abernathy's piano room. Either way, from the moment Percival discovered opera, he felt an instant connection. Every time he heard the climactic note of a Puccini aria, he'd get chills running from the tip of his whiskers to the end of his tail. He studied the intonation and dramatic gestures of the performers on ancient film reels. When Miss Abernathy wasn't looking, he would sneak onto the piano bench and hiss out his best imitation of the high notes he'd learned. Despite the obvious fact that every attempt at singing left Miss Abernathy's fine china rattling, Percival persisted. In his mind, he sounded phenomenal. However, the sad reality was that whenever he opened his mouth to sing, the noise was akin to an overfilled teapot squealing on the stovetop. Percival's voice cracked and croaked, blending cat-like yowls and wavering shrieks into an incoherent smorgasbord of sound. Yet, no matter how many times he was asked, politely or otherwise, to please keep it down, Percival remained undeterred. He believed wholeheartedly, or whisker and tail as he liked to say, that he was destined for stardom. The minor detail that he couldn't hold a note was inconvenient, but that didn't stop him from trying. After all, cats never do anything halfway. One morning, as Miss Abernathy dozed in her rocking chair, wearing her favorite embroidered cardigan, Percival pranced around the living room while a particularly triumphant opera boomed from the record player. The crescendo soared, the tenor's voice dancing around the furniture. Percival tried to match the notes, mewling in an unholy falsetto that made Miss Abernathy's canary, Beethoven, squawk in panic. Eyes still closed, Miss Abernathy waved her hand. "Percival, darling, kindly cease your musical tyranny," she muttered. Despite her admonishment, Percival remained enthusiastic. After all, big dreams seldom fit within the confines of politeness. The cat's tireless ambition found unexpected support one autumn afternoon when the local newspaper, the Croning Chronicle, announced an upcoming open audition for the city's opera competition. Anyone could audition, it said. This no-holds-barred extravaganza viewed itself as a talent-scouring event for undiscovered superstars. The winner would receive a year's scholarship to the prestigious Pantaloon Conservatory, as well as a starring role in the City Opera's next production. The word anyone awakened Percival's determination. Surely a talking cat is still a someone, he reasoned. So, with renewed conviction, the orange tabby set his sights on that competition. Despite Miss Abernathy's attempts at rational guidance pointing out that while a cat possessed many talents, a keen sense of pitch might not be among them, Percival refused to yield. He drafted a plan. First, ask Miss Abernathy for formal singing lessons. Second, practice day and night until his voice soared like a skylark. When Miss Abernathy tentatively agreed to give him lessons, she introduced an old metronome, a portable keyboard, and encouraged diaphragmatic breathing. Percival, perched on the piano bench, placed his paws in a posture resembling a refined aristocrat awaiting tea. Miss Abernathy tapped a slow count on the metronome, and Percival opened his mouth. Instead of a mellifluous note, a hoarse squeak emerged, so piercing that both teacher and pupil cringed in unison. They pressed on, day after day. Lessons began with gentle vocal exercises. Mi, me, ma, mi, mo, moo, recited carefully. Percival dutifully followed the routines, but discovered that controlling pitch with his feline anatomy was an uphill battle. "I don't even have lips like humans do," he complained. Ms. Abernathy reminded him that Scotty, her friend's parrot, could mimic entire solos. "Feathers or fur you can still learn," she said. Percival wasn't so sure, but he persevered. He recited phrases in Italian, though his accent was more reminiscent of a wayward cat that had hopped southbound freight trains for 3 weeks. Ms. Abernathy's unwavering faith in his effort pushed him along, and in moments of frustration she would pat him gently on the head, as if to say, "We'll see." At night, while Ms. Abernathy dozed, Percival snuck into the living room to watch piles of DVD recordings of famous singers Luciano Pavarotti, the iconic tenor, and Felina Caballé, the matriarch of high notes. Percival studied every expressive gesture, memorized each run, and practiced breathing techniques with comical zeal. He learned to stand on his hind legs to anchor his diaphragm, though at times he toppled over. Optimism surged through every whisker in his body. Though his voice remained dreadful, he maintained an unwavering belief that sooner or later, the leap toward improvement would become as effortless as pouncing on a rubber mouse toy. Soon, audition day arrived. Percival insisted that Miss Abernathy accompany him to City Hall, where the competition's preliminary elimination round was being held. The lines were long, and the cacophony, blasting from the backstage area, ranged from nerves-induced croaking to genuinely wondrous singing. Singers of all shapes, sizes, and species — actually, the species part included only Percival, though no one seemed to notice at first — milled about anxiously, warming up. A short woman with pink hair accompanied a towering baritone wearing suspenders, and near them a teenage girl tested out a fragile high note while clutching a half-finished coffee cup. Percival, tail swishing anxiously, rubbed shoulders with prospective opera stars. He wore his best black velvet collar with a tiny embroidered tuxedo front. Once people realized that a cat with impeccable posture and speaking ability stood in line, the whispers began rippling through the crowd. Some murmured in confusion, "Did I hear that cat talk? Is he actually auditioning? How is that even allowed?" But no official rule barred talking cats from competing. In fact, a typed flyer clearly stated, "All are welcome to audition." Ms. Abernathy gave them a polite, tight-lipped smile, as if to say, "Yes, it's real. Yes, we know it's unusual. Please be kind." The host of the competition, a flamboyant man named Maestro Palazzo, burst into view wearing a frilly purple cravat. He had exactly 12 ringlets of hair precariously perched on his otherwise shiny head. Maestro Palazzo spotted Percival and Ms. Abernathy, eyebrows skyrocketing. "A cat? Remarkable. More original than the 1,000th attempt at Nessun Dorma today," he exclaimed, flinging his arms wide. Miss Abernathy introduced Percival, who responded with a polite bow and a chipper, "Meow is it going, sir?" Everyone within earshot fell silent, with curiosity, amusement, and some pity. Palazzo extended an encouraging wave. "Well, let's see what you've got, my whiskered friend." As audition after audition unfolded, Percival waited, tail curling anxiously. Some performances were breathtaking. A young man belted a version of La Donna Mobile that nearly lifted the stage. Others were unexpectedly comedic. An older gentleman forgot his lyrics midway and tried to improvise lines about pasta and pizza. Eventually, Palazzo boomed, "Next up, the cat with a dream, Percival." Miss Abernathy nudged him forward. Percival's heart pounded as he traversed the wooden boards under the stage lights. He faced an ornate auditorium where the judging panel sat sternly. On the far left was a fussy, bespectacled woman who scrawled notes with a quill. To her right was a tall, expressionless man in a black suit. In the middle was the famed coloratura soprano, Madame Laspique, wearing a gown that shimmered like fish scales. And next to her was a bored, mustachioed man flipping through a dog-eared music score. Percival swallowed hard. He cleared his throat with a polite, "Ugh," signaled for the pianist to play. The introduction raced through the chords, rising dramatically. Percival opened his mouth and let out a yowl that pierced the rafters. His attempt to sing the first note flailed so wildly that the pianist nearly fell off the bench in alarm. Panic flooded Percival's green eyes. He attempted to correct the note, but it morphed into a squeak so dissonant, the mustachioed judge covered his ears. Sweat began to trickle down Miss Abernathy's brow in the wings. This was even worse than she had feared. The cat's voice soared from one off-key wavelength to another, never quite landing on the intended pitch. Percival tried valiantly, but the audience was wincing en masse. By the time he reached the big crescendo and ear-punishing screech that sounded like nails on a chalkboard, the panel was gripping their seats for dear life. The final chord ended with decisive finality. No applause, only stunned silence. Maestro Palazzo cleared his throat. "Well," he said gingerly, eyeing the cat, "that was certainly inventive." The bespectacled woman scribbled furious notes. The tall man stared at the cat with pity. Madame Lespique said nothing, her eyelids fluttering in disbelief. The mustachioed judge coughed. "Thank you, Mr. Cat," Palazzo said. "We'll be in touch." Embarrassed and mortified, Percival slunk off the stage, tail drooping, whiskers sagging as if gravity had increased tenfold. Miss Abernathy hustled him out of the building and into the crisp evening air. Outside, his voice trembling, Percival asked, "Miss Abernathy, do you think I have a chance?" Miss Abernathy paused. In her eyes was a flash of heartbreak for the cat's shattered dream, but also a motherly desire not to extinguish his hope. "I believe," she said, "that there are so many ways to express music. Perhaps, maybe you should just keep trying to find your own voice." Percival nodded in despair. On the one paw he could talk, he could communicate, but on the other paw he certainly couldn't sing. The days crawled by, overshadowed by that humiliating audition. Life returned to an aimless, subdued routine of mealtime purrs and occasional strings of conversation. Miss Abernathy kindly stopped formal lessons, sensing that additional screechy sessions would only deepen his gloom. After 2 weeks of hearing nothing, Percival stumbled upon an unexpected letter in the mail. It was addressed, not to Miss Abernathy, but specifically to Percival C. Tabbington, Esquire, in fine calligraphy. He slid it open with a single claw. Inside was a formal invitation from the illustrious Madame Lespique herself, requesting Percival's presence at a special coaching session in the Opera House's rehearsal room. "I know potential when I see it," the letter said, "and I want to see if we can bring out the star in you." Percival nearly fainted with excitement. Madame Lespique was legendary for her ability to conquer stratospheric notes that caused champagne glasses to shatter. She was well known for intimidating critics and supporters alike with her imperious manner. But, for reasons beyond Percival's comprehension, she believed in him. Ms. Abernathy was so exhilarated that she celebrated by preparing a lavish bowl of cream for Percival and a slice of apple pie for herself. That weekend, they arrived at the Grand Opera House, stepping through massive double doors carved with golden cherubs. The space smelled of old velvet, dust, and magic. They wandered the labyrinthine corridors until they found Madame Lespique's private rehearsal studio. Madame Lespique awaited them in a flamboyant purple kimono, her hair piled impossibly high. "Welcome," she cooed, bending down to pat Percival on the head. "I must say, your audition was unusual, but I heard something in your voice, a spirit, a spark. We will refine it." She brandished her baton as if leading an invisible orchestra. With that, lessons began. Percival soon discovered that Madame Lespique's methods bordered on the bizarre. One day, she made him sing from the top of a tall stepladder, "To fully expand your torso." Another day, she insisted that he hold a small rubber duck in his mouth during scales, to strengthen the corners of the mouth. While Miss Abernathy watched uncertainly from a corner, Madame Lespique cackled with glee. "Again! Ooh, again," she'd say, as Percival meowed through the squeaky toy. The results were not exactly pleasing to the ear, but Lespique insisted it was part of the journey. She taught him to freeze at the perfect moment, and to push with the diaphragm like he was about to cough up a hairball, only in a refined melodic way. Opera is no place for shame, she proclaimed. Sing proudly, even if you're a cat. He tried and tried, each session concluding with him collapsing on the floor in exhaustion, chasing after breath. Only Miss Abernathy's gentle massaging of his ears soothed him. Though improvements were incremental as squeak, more sustained tone his attempts still bore a distinct feline warble that hovered miles away from any known pitch. Lespeak never scolded him. Instead, she demanded, "Put more heart, more drama in it. Opera's about telling a story. If you must meow, then meow with passion." So meow he did, loudly and unapologetically, eventually discovering that if he shaped the meow just so, it sometimes stumbled into a passable note. Weeks went by. The final round of the competition loomed. Winners of the earlier rounds had been chosen, among them a refined baritone named Fabrizio, an ambitious mezzo-soprano named Gloria, and a young tenor called Pascal who claimed he once sang to a flock of migrating geese. Percival had squeaked through on a technicality, largely thanks to Madame Lespeck vouching for him, and probably scaring the other judges away from objecting. The culminating performance was to be held on the Opera House's grand stage, open to the public and the press. Each finalist would sing an aria to be judged, culminating in awarding the grand champion. On the big night, the Opera House buzzed with excitement. Reporters showed up, intrigued by news that a talking cat was among the finalists. The seats filled with audience members decked out in suits, gowns, and curious expression. Miss Abernathy, trembling with pride and anxiety, dressed in her best sequined shawl in a front-row seat, coupled with Madame Lespeak's dramatic entrance wearing a plumed headdress and brandishing her baton, it was a spectacle that no sensible opera lover would miss. Backstage, Percival had never felt more nervous. Even a nimble cat might be undone by stage fright. He watched Fabrizio deliver a soul-stirring baritone performance. Every note placed precisely, deep as a full-bodied cello. The crowd roared with cheers. Next up was Gloria, her mezzo voice piercing with an emotional purity that left the audience dazzled. Finally, Pascal soared through his big aria, making it look effortless. Their mastery underscored Percival's insecurities. Everything about him, from his furry muzzle to his shaky warbles, felt out of place, but the sight of Mrs. Abernathy's encouraging smile, along with Madame Lespeak's determined nod, spurred him forward. When Palazzo announced Percival the Opera Cat, a hush fell. Lights blinded him as he stepped onto the stage, the crowd murmuring. Some had come expecting a comedic fiasco. Others wondered if it was a publicity stunt. Percival's heart pounded so loudly, he barely heard the piano intro. He opened his mouth and out came a strangled squeak. Panic threatened to overwhelm him. The dreadful memory of that first audition replayed in his mind. He coughed, meowed, tried again. Another trembling, slightly off-key note warbled out, inching closer to the correct pitch than ever before, but still not quite there. The audience fidgeted. Suddenly, as the piano carried the melody forward, Percival remembered Madame Lespeak's words. "Sing your story. Even if it's meows, each note must be brimming with purpose." So he thought of everything he'd experienced, long, lazy afternoons, Miss Abernathy's gentle support, the humiliating audition, the hours of bizarre training with a rubber duck. He recalled the thrill of hearing his first opera record and the sensation of that music flooding his entire being. With a deep breath, he let that joy surge through his whiskers. He meowed the next phrase without apology. It was shaky, sure, and the pitch wobbled, but it had heart. Something extraordinary happened. The audience sensed his sincerity. They began to lean in. The meowing soared in a cat-like approximation of the aria's line, comedic yet strangely moving. The notes were nowhere close to perfect, but the emotion rang true. His furry face scrunched with concentration, he poured every fiber of his being into each improbable syllable. The intensity of his performance, pure feline passion, made people smile. By the time he reached the big climax, he unleashed a hearty yowl that rolled around the hall. Many watchers, enthralled by the sheer earnestness, broke into applause. Even a few cheers rang out. He ended on a final note that might have had the ghost of musical correctness, or maybe not, but it was real, raw, and astonishingly passionate. When he finished, The opera house erupted with thunderous applause. Some of it, perhaps, was for the spectacle of a cat standing on two legs and attempting to sing opera. But more than that, they were applauding his bravery, refusing to let species or talent limitations stifle him. Percival blinked back tears of gratitude. Madame Lespique let out a triumphant cackle from her seat, and Miss Abernathy clapped until her arms ached. Even old Maestro Palazzo jumped up, scattering sheet music everywhere. After the final performances, the judges convened, deliberating in hushed voices. The tension backstage was palpable. Fabrizio consoled him, patting Percival gently. "No matter what happens, you were marvelous in your own cat way," he said. Percival thanked him, though he was sure there was no chance of taking first place. How could a screechy cat defeat all those golden voices? Madame Laspique found him, placing a hand on his shoulder, reaffirming that sometimes artistry transcends technique. Eventually, Palazzo reappeared under the spotlights, tapping the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have our results." A hush fell over the audience. Percival steeled himself. Maestro Palazzo first announced the third-place winner, Pascal, the talented young tenor. The crowd cheered. Then second place, the mezzo-soprano Gloria. She bowed, tears glistening. Pallas hammered the tension. And now the grand champion of this year's competition. A short pause. Fabrizio Faustino. The crowd erupted into cheers for the baritone, who accepted his trophy with a modest grin. He took a triumphant bow, and the judges congratulated him. Percival's heart sank, though he couldn't say he was surprised. No doubt Fabrizio was an incredible singer. Percival was about to slip away into the wings when Maestro Palazzo raised his arms again. "We have a special mention," the room hushed, "for extraordinary bravery, sincerity, and, well, unstoppable spirit. We present Percival with our first ever Heart of the Opera award." The opera house roared with approval. Percival, eyes wide, trotted to center stage. Palazzo handed him a glittering medal on a ribbon size for a cat. The audience gave him a standing ovation, an email mask, standing there wearing his medal. Percival felt something deeper than just the applause. For the first time, he felt peace with himself. He might never master pitch, but he had found an expression that connected with people on an emotional level. As the crowd chanted his name, he realized fame was never truly the goal. Belonging to something and sharing his unique voice had been the ultimate reward. In the competition's aftermath, articles popped up in the Crooning Chronicle praising Percival's performance. One comedic journalist wrote, "Though it sounded like he was strangling a clarinet, Percival stole the show with raw sincerity." Another crowned him as opera's most courageous cat, while some cynics wondered if it was a publicity stunt. For his part, Percival didn't mind the jokes. He had never asked to be perfect, only to be heard. And heard he was. Life took on a new shape. Fabrizio, the champion, invited Percival to join him on a small charity tour across local schools, hospitals, and community centers. They'd sing duets, okay, Fabrizio would sing, and Percival would. The results always ended in uproarious laughter or wide-eyed wonder, but the audience was universally pleased. Miss Abernathy, proud as a peacock, accompanied them, offering gentle, encouraging nods. Madame Laspic popped up occasionally, showering them with flamboyant applause and fresh life lessons. Even Beethoven, the canary, at home, seemed to chirp with newfound camaraderie, unthreatened by Percival's attempts at coloratura. Not long after, Miss Abernathy's phone began ringing with unexpected requests. A children's music show wanted to feature Percival in a cameo. A city official proposed that Percival be the ambassador for an Arts for All campaign, inspiring kids to try their hand or paw at music. Invitations to local radio segments poured in, not because of the cat's pitch, but because of his message, that nothing should stop a dreamer from trying to create art, even if they lack natural skill. "You taught us that sincerity and passion can trump perfect notes," exclaimed one local DJ during an interview. Percival purred in satisfaction. Over time, Percival accepted that he would never reach the polished heights of great opera singers, but the cat discovered a niche. He became the official opera ambassador of the city's youth program, wandering in during rehearsals to encourage eager novices, young and old, to chase their musical dreams. He taught them the difference between singing to impress and singing to express. He'd address them in his gentlemanly voice, telling them to never be afraid to make a joyful noise. Children giggled as they tried to mimic his warbling meows, weaving them into songs. The sense of fun and freedom that he brought to music was liberating. Parents who had once rolled their eyes at the thought of a singing cat found themselves cheering as their kids overcame stage fright. Mrs. Abernathy began to break out her old violin, performing duets with Percival's caterwauling, turning it into an unexpectedly charming show for charity events. And so, Percival lived a life that was more fulfilling than the glimmer of a single gold trophy could ever provide. Yes, his aria might make a few dogs in the neighborhood howl in empathy, or perhaps protest, and yes, professional critics might declare him woefully off-key, yet none of that mattered. He was performing on street corners, in school auditoriums, or once in a while back at the opera house for a comedic cameo, always with a grin on his whiskered face. On one particularly balmy afternoon, Ms. Abernathy found him on the window seat, gazing out at the garden. Turning away from the bird feeders, he said softly, "I'm so very grateful, Ms. Abernathy, grateful for your patience, for believing in me, for letting me try." She scooped him up in a gentle hug, stroking his ears. "I'm proud of you, my dear Percival. Whether your notes are off or on, you have an artist's soul." Percival's purr rumbled in contentment. He might never conquer the official stage in the classical sense, but he had indeed claimed a place in the hearts of those who saw him. He was living proof that the voice that matters most is the one that refuses to be silenced. That very night, as Miss Abernathy prepared supper, Percival settled down by the record player. Carefully, he placed the needle on one of his favorite arias. The instrument swelled and the singer soared. Percival clasped his paws together, heart racing. Then, feeling the music surge within him, he opened his mouth and meowed. Off-key with comedic vibrato, but with every ounce of emotion he had. And in that moment, every fiber of his being sang in glorious, unshackled, unashamed spontaneity. He found his voice not in the perfection of pitch, but in the freedom of letting his passion ring out. And in the near distance, you could almost hear the sound of Miss Abernathy's teacups rattling ominously, for Percival was still Percival, just a cat who talked a big game and sang more like a squeaky hinge than an operatic virtuoso. But oh, did he sing, and oh, did everyone listen.